welcome back. We are going to be doing some notes today on the Italian Renaissance. And this is a time period that is identified within specifically European history. So we're going to do some notes today and tomorrow about this. And your essential questions for this set of notes are: 1, what are the main characteristics of the Italian Renaissance? 2, what were the results of the Italian Wars? And 3, which Renaissance artists were the Ninja Turtles named after? And that last one's just for fun. Also, if you're wondering why I'm wearing Mickey Mouse ears, it's because today is Christmas vacation, dress-up day, so I am a Disney tourist. So I thought, why not? It's Christmas. It'll be fun. So if you remember, we just finished one of our longest units of the year, which was the post-classical period. And we talked about how one of the things that people debate about studying history and how we should talk about history is that many people called the post-classical period, they will call it the Dark Ages. And that's sort of a misnomer because it was only dark for Europeans. But this sort of leads into what we're talking about here, because this is the time period right after the quote-unquote Dark Ages in Europe. And so that's also why they call this next time period in their history a Renaissance. So what does that mean? A Renaissance is a revival of something, and so the word Renaissance literally means rebirth. And basically this was the time in Europe that people went from sort of this darker period in the post-classical period to now kind of bouncing back, right? They're trying to bring back, learning, intellectual pursuits, scientific advancement, etc. So the people of Italy believed that they had sort of seen a rebirth of all of the culture and all of the art and all of the ways of thinking of the ancient Greeks and Romans. And so they sort of see this as a rebirth of all of that. So one thing you might be wondering, if it's all about Europe, why are we talking specifically about Italy? Well, that is because this is sort of where the European Renaissance began, because if you look at this map, and if you recall from what we've learned a little bit about Europe at the time, Italy is a peninsula. It's surrounded by water on 3 sides. And remember, in our notes way back on medieval Europe, we talked about how Italy was full of port cities. And so there was a lot of trade coming in and out of Italy. Even in quote-unquote dark times, such as the Crusades, when there were all these wars happening, still, people had to bring ships in and out of those port cities to bring supplies for the soldiers, to bring soldiers to different areas. And so that was an influx of goods and spending, and it was an economic boost for Italy. So Italy is set up perfectly to be a place where something like this Renaissance can be launched. And so some of the things that were common at this time, Italy was made up mostly of urban societies, so they had really big major cities that had a lot going on economically, politically, and socially. And so they were sort of the center of everything. And then also we see coming out of the Middle Ages that Europeans were becoming more and more secular in their worldview. And that means that they were less religious. And that makes sense because we talked a little bit about, when we learned about the plague, we learned about how a lot of people, they leaned on their religion through that, and some people started to question their religion because of that event in history, because they questioned why, if there is a God, why would he do this to us? Or why didn't he answer us when we asked for help? And so a lot of people are sort of breaking off from that. Now, there's still plenty of Europeans that are religious, and you're going to see that reflected in the artworks that become very famous from this time. So it's not a total change, but we're just slowly moving closer in that more secular or worldly direction. Okay, so to sum up what the Renaissance is, to give you a short version, this is what Europeans call an age of recovery after numerous disasters. So after the plague, after years of decline in church power and instability in Europe, this is sort of a comeback period for them. And one thing that really, a major thing that comes out of this period is this way of thinking, this intellectual movement called humanism. So humanism is based on the idea of having a very high view of humanity and human worth, and aiming to see a realization of what humans can achieve. So I always tell my students, when you hear humanism, think, yay, humans. Right? It's a very positive view of humanity and looking towards hopefully humans reaching their full potential. So in other words, it's an emphasis on the ability of humans and what we can do, and not looking at limitations. So it's a very positive outlook on humanity, which is interesting because we're coming out of the quote-unquote dark ages where things were a little different in that realm. They were a lot more negative. Okay, so take a second to review what we've already learned, and I want you to think and be able to explain in your own words, so try to do this without looking back at your notes. But why did the Renaissance start in Italy of all places? So there's some hints here at the bottom of the screen for you. Pause the video and see if you can answer that in your notes. Okay, so here is a different way to explain it. So in looking at these pictures, you've got people in Italy were wealthy because they were able to trade more easily and widely because they're a peninsula, right? They have all those port cities. And because of that, they have more money, they're very wealthy, and because they're so wealthy, they are able then to invest their money in things like art or intellectual pursuits, so studying different things like science, technology, philosophy, etc. All right, now here's another question to quiz yourself. Which of these is a major characteristic of the Renaissance? A, conformity to church ideals, B, a push to pagan rites, C, emphasis on human ability, or D, an increase of Muslim territory in Europe. If you chose C, then you are correct. Good job. Okay, so now let's talk about some of these major cities that are sort of centers of economic, social, and political activity in Italy. So these are the Italian states. So Italy failed to develop a strong central monarchy as their government. And so what happened was that they developed into more city-states that were able to remain independent of any kind of national level of governing. And so you have city-states that run themselves. So, for example, we have one major city-state was Milan, and this is located in northern Italy. And it's at the crossroads of a lot of trade routes through Italy. So it's a very strategic place to be. And because of that, they are very rich and very powerful. So, for example, Milan was ruled by the Sforza family, and Francesco Sforza was the last great ruler of the Visconti dynasty. Francesco Sforza basically does a couple of big things. Number one, he tries to centralize the state, so tries to centralize the political power in Milan. He also tries to create and succeeds in creating an efficient tax system. And he also is the leader of a band of mercenaries. So if you remember, we talked a little bit about mercenaries in the Roman Empire, and we've talked a little bit about them here and there, but mercenaries are soldiers who are paid, and they give their service and their loyalty to the highest bidder, so to speak. So they work for money, and so whoever pays them the most is who gets them as a soldier. So he was a leader of this band of mercenaries. And I just want to remind you that at the end of the Middle Ages, many European countries sought to create new monarchies and reestablish the power of kings. And so Italy was different. They did not want that, and so they're doing their own thing. All right, so some other Italian states that are really important in this time period are Venice and Florence. Venice is also located in northern Italy, like Milan, and it was seen as a link between Asia and Western Europe. So this is where a lot of people came in and out of Italy from Asia. And it was run by a group of small, wealthy merchants. So they ran the city-state based on their own needs and desires. And then you have Florence. Florence is also a major city-state in the Renaissance, and it is established as a republic. So if you remember, a republic is when you have leaders who are elected as representatives of the people, so similar to what we have in the U.S. today. And it's located in southern Italy. So rather than having a family in charge or a small group of, wealthy merchants, you have just a small group who are elected and run the government of this city-state. And particularly the Florentine leaders were very successful in war. And again, all these cities, one thing they all have in common is that they're economically booming. And so in Florence, their economy was mainly based on the manufacturing of cloth. And even today, if you visit Florence, you see a lot of that for sale, and that is still a big part of their economy. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about the Italian War. So this is going to relate to one of your essential questions. So the leader of France, who was Charles VIII, saw how well things were going in Italy and how wealthy Italians were, and was attracted to the riches of Italy. He wanted to get in on that game. And so he decides to attack Naples, the city of Naples, in 1494. So French and Spanish soldiers hold on to the land for 30 years, back and forth, constant fighting for 30 years. They're trying to take control of Italy. But what ends up happening is that the mercenaries that are fighting are slowly losing their pay. The leaders of the armies that they're helping can't afford to pay them anymore, and eventually they decide that they want their money, so they just turn and start pillaging the cities that they're supposed to be fighting for. And so they turn around and sack Rome. And so Rome gets sacked in 1527 by the Spanish. And as a result, the Spanish become a more powerful force in Italy. And so this is why you see a lot of influence between Spain and Italy. So this is a result of the Italian Wars. Now let's talk about Renaissance society a little bit in Europe. So in the Renaissance period in Europe, there were certain characteristics that were pretty common. So first off, there were three main social classes, or three, as we call them, estates. And those were the nobility, the peasants, and the townspeople. So the nobility was made up of old nobility, but also new nobility. So think of it like old money and young money, right? You've heard that before. So they still hold quite a lot of power, even though the feudal system fell apart at the end of the medieval period. And nobles were still born, not made. So they were still people who were born into the upper class, and not necessarily people that worked their way up. They were also typically trained in classical education, meaning they studied all of the works and all of the language and intellectual pursuits of the ancient Greeks and Romans, including military training. And they were held to a very high standard of conduct. Okay, then you also have your peasants. Those are the lower class sort of commoners. And then you have townspeople, who are made up of the merchants and the artisans. So those are the people who make the goods and sell the goods that are crafted in this area. And within that class, they have their own hierarchy. But in general, as a big picture society, there are these three different classes. All right, similar to what we've talked about before, family is a very big part of everyday life in Europe. And when it came to getting married, some things that were common at the time. Number one, marriage was seen as a way to gain security for your family. Two, there were arranged marriages in which a family would set aside a bit of money called a dowry, and when their daughter got married, her husband would get this dowry. And so that played a role in who she was able to court, who would be interested in marrying her. Men would look for a woman that had a good dowry. And if a girl had not a great dowry, it was a lot harder for her to find a partner to marry. And of course, then that shows us that it's still patriarchal. So we still see that the father or husband is the center of the family.